Welcome, I'm Michael Bickert. Thanks for joining me today as we explore concepts with the objective of improving your management skills and growing your business. Grab your notepads and your pens because I want you to take notes. You know that I want you to take notes. Please take notes. I want you to jot down some sort of action item that you can implement in your business today because that's what this is all about. That's why we get together. Implementation to drive your business forward. Ideas are grand and discussing things is fine, but it's where implementation is present that you will move things forward and you will advance. Perpetual refinement. All right, recently I was asked to weigh in on a situation and give some advice given a situation that was occurring with a client. And I can't get into too many details and the names have been changed to protect the innocent sort of situation. But what the gist of it was that there was an employee whose performance had deteriorated significantly and the business was not particularly happy with the performance of this individual, and any attempts management made to turn things around seemed to be futile. They were not going in the right direction, and this just stretched out over a long period of time. This is very common. I observe this in a lot of businesses. And I want to say up front here, I have done several videos to address this kind of thing. However, it's not necessarily obvious to somebody, like, what are those axioms? What are the foundational principles that are guiding and leading to these things, which this is a symptom. This is symptomatic of some dysfunction within the business. And that sounds maybe a little harsh or critical to say it that way, but we do need to be critical and we do need to accept the reality. When you are having undesirable outcomes, that is symptomatic of something, an underlying problem. And in this instance, the person, just generally speaking, the person's performance had started to suffer. And there seemed to be, you've heard it said, the attitude. All of a sudden, the communication is labored and there's pushback and a lack of respect seems to be there between the individual and management. Any number of things. And what I would say, this is kind of in retrospect, but what I did advise is, first of all, this is a symptom of a lack of accountability. That's one thing that's obvious. And so you should visit our video where I elaborate on accountability and how we actually secretly or sort of subconsciously, we actually appreciate being held accountable. But many businesses, whether it's the flawed thinking of the person in management who's trying to be a nice guy, so to speak, all the time, or doesn't, they maybe don't have a lot of practice in the skills of accountability. So you need to have accountability. And this also, we talk about report cards and performance evaluations. I could tell you up front, and it turned out to be true, this company was not doing regularly scheduled performance evaluations. So visit I think we've got like 3 or 4 videos in which we discuss the importance of performance, not performance reviews. I like to say performance evaluations. I think the term performance review is so often associated with talking about remuneration or a raise, and that can happen at the same time as a performance evaluation, but it is not necessarily the case every time. So performance evaluation and having report card meetings on a regularly scheduled basis, I knew that wasn't happening because that's where the opportunity to hold people accountable comes in. And these things can't be done in your spare time. As a manager, you don't have spare time. So you've got to schedule these things and you have to prioritize them. And it's not obvious to the manager at the time when he puts these things aside, and I'm not talking about this specific manager, I'm talking about all of us in management. When we put things aside, we procrastinate on them. What we're doing is we're tricking ourselves into believing, what I'm working on right now is more important. I can put this aside. And you should always work on that stuff which is most important. Yet, what we miss out on is it's the things that are not urgent. And we've got videos on that. Those things which are absolutely important, but they're not urgent, because I don't need to do a performance evaluation meeting today with somebody. If I had to postpone it, it wouldn't be the end of the world. It's not urgent, but it is important, because just like with exercise and all these other types of analogies I can give about things that are important and not urgent, the world won't stop if we put them off today. But what happens is it becomes a habit, and so you never do it. And that's what happened in this instance, is that you never get around to performance evaluations. And what I was really getting at is that what's at stake isn't obvious in the moment. It's kind of like, again, if I use the wellness analogy, is that, you know, you're not suffering of some sort of lifestyle related chronic disease today, but chronically, or the perpetual decision to put things off and procrastinate in dealing with your health or exercise or something like that can lead to that. And then when you're facing that lifestyle related chronic disease, now it's like, oh boy. And we fail to make that association in our mind. And it's the same thing here, where people are asking me, how did this happen? This was a really good person. This person at one time was really doing well for the company. We were so excited and very satisfied, and yet now it's come to this. Well, relationships don't just deteriorate, you know, in an instant. Deterioration by nature happens over time, and it's because you are being negligent in some way. So failing to do those performance evaluations, that is omitting the opportunities, the scheduled, the periodic, frequent, perhaps consistent at least, scheduled meetings to communicate and really take a look at where you stand and communicate with one another. That raises things. That's that opportunity to get feedback. It's just not one way. It's not like just pulling up the report card on a screen and saying, look, you're underperforming in this area, you're overperforming here, or you're doing great job here, pat on the back there. You know, that's the gist of it, but what really happens, the nuance, is what occurs in between, is that the person starts to explore and give reasons for why maybe they're underperforming in a particular way. And sometimes these things happen where we feel guilty, or we're not particularly proud of our own efforts or our own results, and we may develop contempt for the people that are expecting something of us. And we are hiding because of that lack of communication. We're not telling them where they are lacking, providing something that we may think we need in order to perform, so we feel a bit helpless, and that can manifest in symptoms of animosity and hostility in communications and that kind of thing. So give some consideration to this kind of thing. So the first one, as I said, was there's a lack of accountability, and that ties really well in with you're not doing your performance evaluations. The other video I had that I would recommend this client and you, if you're experiencing things like this, is to look at our video on boundaries, because in this particular case, there was poor boundaries. Maybe I wouldn't say no boundaries, because there's always some sort of boundary, but people who haven't practiced or don't understand how boundaries work, they typically don't exercise those good, consistent behaviors that result in defining boundaries and defining consequences for people crossing boundaries or not respecting boundaries. That's a really important concept as well. It has been said that people treat us the way we teach them to. And that is another way of saying people are going to continually test those boundaries. And when they realize, hey, I can get away with this particular way of treating somebody, and maybe it's, you know, it might feel disrespectful from one person's perspective, the other person may be like, well, that's the way we've always communicated. And so if there's something that you are unhappy with and how you're being treated, you need to bring that up. It requires communication. You have to have courage to bring this up. We have a video on that as well. You know, don't hide behind written communication. Make sure you favor effective forms of communication, face-to-face. These things, the humanities portion of business, require face-to-face interaction, honest, candid discussion. As I say these things, I think of all the videos we have on this, candor, and the importance of candor in your communication. This is really important stuff here. And I alluded to earlier that this is almost assuredly a situation where the person is manifesting some hostility or whatever because they feel a little bit of contempt toward the business and management, because they feel that their hands are tied. Maybe they're unfulfilled in some way, and that comes back to the obligations. In fact, what I want to get across to you today is that if a business relationship, an employee employer relationship doesn't work out, I want you as an effective manager to accept that you have some responsibility in that each and every time. You've got to look inwardly. There's no point in dwelling too much on what the person did wrong. Like if the employment is going to terminate, either someone's going to quit or they need to be asked to leave, they're fired. We've got a video on that as well, being fired, and probably many of the concepts I'm talking about today will overlap with those, but look at that one. If you feel that you're at a point where you need to perhaps fire someone, watch that video as well. But regardless of the reason that employment needs to be terminated and it ends poorly, there's no sense in really focusing on what the other person did wrong or what faults they had. There might be a little bit in there, because then you can that can lead you to ask, well, how did that happen? Like, was it because of poor recruitment, or was it that, this person was, there were signs earlier and we should have acted on that or whatever. But I would encourage you rather to focus most of the attention on inwardly, introspection. Take a look at what you could have done different. And I made the case to this when this person approached me for a little bit of advice. I said, when somebody quits, there can be a number of reasons for that. And there's probably something that you could do better to as a manager and as a business to ensure success the next time around, and you should explore that and try to figure what that is. But when somebody needs to be fired, in those instances, it's almost exclusively, ironically, coming down to you failing to meet your obligations. And I challenged in the discussion, I said, if you can give me an example of where that's not the case, I'd be curious. And actually, it's a bit moot, because as I thought about it, yeah, there are exceptions to every rule. The key is, we don't manage by the exception, we manage by the rule. And I say it's ironic that when you have to fire somebody, that you should be looking inwardly, and you will always find that you have failed to meet one of your 4 obligations. If you don't know the 4 obligations, we're going to cover them a little bit here, but certainly visit, again, the video I have on the 4 obligations of management. That's a critical piece that you need to understand. You're going to have all sorts of these problems in your business if you don't meet your obligations. It is ironic, though, because you're firing somebody and you are you have just cause, you have good reason to do so. And I would recommend that you absolutely do so when you come to that conclusion. Still, it is preventable because of your obligations. That's where the irony is. I hope you can see the irony there. It's like when somebody quits, it's not necessarily your fault. But when you need to fire somebody, you should do it, but it's probably your fault in some way, and yet you're justified. And certainly within the confines of the law, you're probably justified in doing this without issue. And we're not covering the things to do with the law and all that kind of stuff. That differs from one geographical location to another. We want to deal with the more philosophical, foundational principles of doing this. So, for example, the first obligation is to make sure you hire somebody with the right raw materials to be able to do the job. So you in your recruitment, in your talent acquisition, you make sure that you're not hiring someone where your expectations would be unrealistic because they just can't do it. And I make the example of, okay, if you need someone to pilot a mission to Mars as an astronaut and you hire me, I'm very good at certain things, but I am unqualified. And so that's an extreme example, of course, just to sort of demonstrate the point. Sometimes we hire people, and because we didn't do the right due diligence, or we didn't spend sufficient requisite time in making sure that we've got the right candidate, we hire somebody and we have expectations that they're just not going to be able to deliver on. They don't have the aptitude, experience, or whatever may be necessary. So that's the first obligation, that sometimes when you reach this, a person, again, when we go back to that hostility that can develop over time and the contempt, it could be like, well, you had unrealistic expectations of me ever since I started. I noticed, and that's why it might have started well in the beginning and it ends poorly. Going back, if we would have done some of those performance evaluations, this stuff can come up, and then before we get to a place where the relationship is beyond salvaging, we could maybe find a use for that person's greatest talents in another area in the organization. And so once again, hiring the right person, that's the first obligation. That's really, really important. What other obligations you might be missing out on? The second one I mentioned several times is communicating clearly, clarifying, clearly communicating your expectations. So we talk about a document with some sort of role description based on objectives. And does the person understand? Again, animosity can build up over time if you are sharing expectations, or you are sharing disappointment of failure to meet expectations, or worse yet, you're not even being candid with that. The person can read it on you. You're acting like you're not particularly happy with their performance, or you're complaining about it, or you're making offhanded remarks once in a while about it. That's not clearly communicating expectations, and the person builds up that animosity, that hostility, going, you know what, I never know what I'm doing is right or wrong. So it comes back again to performance evaluations. The third one is to make sure that you are giving, the third obligation that is, that you are giving the person the requisite training tools and resources. And this is so common, especially onboarding and training is neglected by so many businesses. And again, if I'm a person working in an organization, in a business, and I'm not getting that, I can be very confused over time, and I can feel very helpless where maybe you have told me what your expectations are, and I'm afraid to admit to you as my employer that I'm not able to do it because you have really garbage equipment that you're expecting me to use, or you're lacking a particular tool, or you've never shown me how to do something, and it's not reasonable to expect that I'll just know how to do it unless you told me during the interview process and I falsified information to lead you to believe that I know how to do something. Then it is incumbent upon you to train me how to do it, or at least give me the resources to do some self-study. These things happen time and again, and when you end up firing somebody, you want to look at this. What about that obligation? Then the fourth one we come back to is accountability, and that was what I was harping on throughout this video. And in this case, I know it was a lack of accountability. Now, what was interesting is, and there's maybe some new information here that you wouldn't get in some of my other videos, is I was asked, have you ever seen a situation where you've done your best to try to salvage a relationship and it just kept getting worse and worse, and so you decided finally to do the right things. We're going to hold the person accountable. We're going to do performance evaluation. We're going to exercise some candid communication. Let's try to, and then the person avoids it like the plague. I'm reminded of that scene in Jerry Maguire where he realizes that his relationship with Avery has to end, and Avery is the person he was engaged to at the beginning of the movie. And she's like, nope, not listening. He's trying to break up with her, and she's like, nope, she won't accept it. And I've seen this in business where people will just avoid it. It's like the writing is on the wall and people understand this is gonna end badly, but everybody avoids it. And then maybe the employer, you as the manager, decide, okay, I'm gonna address it. And then the person, it's never a convenient time to meet. Oh yeah, I'd like to meet with you at that time, that I'm really busy. And that's what happened in this instance. And it forced the hand of management to have to use lesser effective forms of communication, digital communication, email and that stuff. Instead of having the face-to-face meeting, they ended up having to use text messages and everything. And the person is still avoiding that because they know the writing's on the wall, and they're like, oh, I can't believe this is breakup time, so to speak. And so I was asked, have you ever had one of those situations, a Costanza situation? There's that episode in one of the early seasons of Seinfeld where George Costanza gets fed up and he quits. He's a real estate agent at the time, and he quits. His boss is a bit of a jerk in the boardroom, and he stands up and makes a big production in front of everybody and storms out. And then he realizes that, what have I done? I've made a terrible mistake here. This is a tough time to find another job or whatever. So he decides to just show back up at the office as if nothing happened, like he didn't quit. Like, what? You took me serious? No. I'm just emotional. Whatever. So that I was asked, has that ever happened to me? Well, I will tell you that I have seen it all. And I thought, it took me a moment. I'm like, yeah, actually, I do remember. I remember someone who quit, who walked out mid-shift. I came out to see. They were upset with the decision I had made. And this person, I went and asked the other managers, where is this person? And well, he was angry and he just stormed out. So essentially, in my mind, he quit. He showed up the next day like nothing was no big deal, and very, very cordial guy, a very great sense of humor and a great personality. He came like nothing happened. Well, I had to say to him, well, you can't do that. You essentially, you quit. You just walk out in the middle of a shift, angry, letting everybody know, you know, you can't just show back up to work. And ultimately that relationship was not going to work out, that employment. But I've seen this many times. And, you know, we might think, well, what does this have to do with the price of tea in China and what we're talking about here? The advice I wanted to give in this instance is, you know, again, to hold people accountable for their decisions. And you got to draw that line in the sand. People treat us the way we teach them to. I taught my management team at that time, you don't get to just walk out, storm out when you're, and you know, miss the rest of your shift if you're not happy with the decision. We have to communicate. It wasn't like we had a blowout argument or whatever. The person was getting upset and at a decision I made, but I stayed firm in my decision, and he stormed out or whatever. So what I did in that instance was a way of not allowing the tail to wag the dog. And you gotta, you know, that expression I use all the time. Don't allow the tail to wag the dog. Your people work for you. They are employed by you. You have obligations to meet, and you want to try to remove obstacles and help them be successful. You're trying to help them be as successful as possible. You have a vested interest in their success, so of course you will try to do that. But people will test those boundaries, remember, and they'll teach you the way you treat them to. And if you let them walk all over you and get away with unacceptable behavior, you're gonna find that, and that's a symptom in your business. If you're noticing people are demonstrating hostility, you know, they're rude, disrespectful in their communications, that is a sign to me that you've allowed that to happen, and you can't allow that to happen. So in the instance of this particular situation, I was asked to weigh in on, well, did the person quit or they fired? And I would default, my advice to you is, the person quits. And so make the situation where the person has to meet with you and talk with you, and you can try to work the situation out, or maybe you've decided that you're going to terminate the situation, but if they won't even meet with you for that meeting, then you've got to set it up where they've essentially quit. So I think that's a fine distinction. You might even think, does that happen often enough? I have seen this happen often enough that, you know, people, the relationship has soured enough that both sides are ready to terminate the relationship, but nobody wants to pull the trigger. The person's like, I'm gonna make them fire me. I'm not gonna quit, and the employers may be like, well, I can see they're gonna quit, so I'll just let them. That is completely dysfunctional. You don't wanna have that. So, you know, bring things through candid communication to a head where you are going to need to meet and discuss the inevitabilities, or whether there is something that's salvageable or not. And if the person avoids that at all costs, then you know, you're going to have to accept their resignation, so to speak, and ask them outright, are you resigning? I need to meet with you. We need to deal with this. If not, you know, are you telling me you're not going to do this and that you're quitting because you're not willing to do? They can't be insubordinate on that. I hate to focus on these negativities, but sometimes this does come up in business. And if you want to avoid this in your business, if you are the type of person who is non-confrontational, and don't think of that as a weakness, think of that as a strength. One of my greatest managers, in fact, I think the greatest manager that ever worked for me, is very non-confrontational. So he would just go further upstream and do a lot of things to put things in place so he would avoid the confrontation. He wouldn't just avoid it, you know, when it comes to a head. He would try to evaluate what would lead to confrontation, what would lead to problems in the business. How can we avoid that to begin with? And that's being proactive. That's what I would recommend. And that's what I'm talking about throughout the beginning of this video, is go back and watch all those other videos and these foundational axiom, first principle thinking about what do I need to do so that I don't have to run into these symptoms in my business. That's critical. So that we can end on a more positive note, is, it's really unfortunate when any kind of relationship has to end. And there is a book called Necessary Endings that you might want to check out. But it does occur sometimes. But on a more positive note, what I would say to you is leverage that opportunity for improvement. Remember, we're all about continuous improvement, perpetual refinement. If it didn't work out with someone and you're taking responsibility, you're doing that introspection, what could we have done better to avoid this, and you accept that and you work on those things, now you can do better recruitment. You could try to trade up, so to speak. The next person that we're going to hire, we're going to make sure that they are at least as good as the person that we've lost. And hopefully we're going to get someone even better. But more importantly, we're going to work on those things we know we need to do to ensure their success and make sure that we are responsible and meeting our obligations. And then you'll just have a much better situation. Your business will move forward. You will have a better relationship with that person. You'll have better results. You're going to be more effective as a manager. Therefore, they will be more effective as one of your team members, and they're very critical. And you can go into this situation. That's sort of the silver lining here. It's like, oh, that was rough. I didn't like that. It had to come to an end, and we had to lose a good person. And everyone's a good person in some way. And we're all a bit of a product of our environments and our way of thinking and our interactions and communications and so forth. So we want to do, as managers, in our commitment to being as effective as possible, we want to create that culture and that environment in which a person can thrive, and then it's not on us that for whatever reason it doesn't work out. We can look ourselves in the mirror and say, you know what, I know I met my obligations and I did everything that I could have done. None of you are perfect. None of us are perfect. And but I want to leave that on that positive note. Just leverage the opportunity to trade up and try to improve the situation and improve your business, because that's why we have these discussions. That's what this is all about. So that's why I want to leave it today. I hope you got something out of this. And I hope you'll leave a comment. If you disagree with something I'm saying or you want to push back, do you have a story or an anecdote that you can share? Leave it in the comments, because when you leave something like that in the comments, other business owners, entrepreneurs, managers, they read that and we learn. And we need to learn from one another. Perpetual refinement.